much, Clemente. I really appreciate it. I love, being able to speak to everybody about this topic, especially. This was really interesting to me. So I'll just start things off, sharing my screen. Hopefully, everybody can see that. Let me know if you have any difficulty with it. But thank you for having me. I love the CUNY system. We were just singing the praises of Elise Mandel before this started, and really enjoy the IO students that I've met through here and the staff members that I've met at CUNY. Uh, just want to learn a little bit about everybody before we officially get started. In the chat, if you can tell me what CUNY campus you're in, and just let me know what is one challenge that you expect to face in the return to work. If you're coming back, what do you think one of the challenges is that you might face as you return to campus? All right. So, just take a moment to type that out. And while you do that, I will just give you a little bit more information about me. I do appreciate the wonderful intro that Clemente gave. Um, so I'm the Vice President of Consulting for a consulting firm known as Talent Metrics. And I'm also an Associate Professor of Industrial Organizational Psychology at Farmingdale State College. In addition to that, I'm also the co-chair of the People Analytics Special Interest Group for the Association for Talent Development in New York City. And I'm also the recipient of the Society for Industrial Organizational Psychology Scholar Practitioner Presidential Recognition. That is as much fun to say 3 times in a row as you might think. And so this is just to say that I kind of navigate two different worlds. I work with organizations, work with companies, and then I'm also in the academic world. And one of the things we're going to spend some time talking about today is the fact that many, organizations function very differently from college campuses. So we see, the way that college campuses function, and they look really different. And so if you get a chance, do me a favor, just type your name into the chat below, and then just let me know what are some of the challenges that you think you're going to face, in the return. So we've got a couple good ones here. So Elise mentions that the challenge, not wanting to meet students' appointments in person, though, my feelings might change as time goes on. Stephanie mentions that anticipated colleagues may feel anxious about returning to on-site work. Sam mentions one challenge I'm having finding balance, organizing system that works for me when I go back and forth between office and work from home. Damaris mentions that new changes with policies, very, very important. Policies have been changing quite a bit. That's been a big challenge for many of us. Marla mentions navigating COVID boundaries. What are the rules? What are the boundaries? Ingrid mentions we're being asked to host more on-campus events. What does that actually mean? We know that everything having to do with COVID increases time to complete, right? And time to do things. We'll talk a little bit about that. Irene mentioned space, not enough to have everybody, especially if you want to maintain some sort of distance. Karima mentions that staff feeling frustrated because so much of the work is going to be over Zoom, and they may have to, work from home or work from campus instead of from home. Allison mentions not wanting to be in the office after finding joy in working from home. Tawana mentions in-person meetings, dealing with staff's fears about the workplace. And then Catherine mentions continued rise in Asian hate, very, very important consideration. Teresa mentions not having more control over my schedule. All right, that's definitely something we're going to spend some time talking about. Kara mentions many staff feel they function better during this period and are resistant to what seems like a return to pre-pandemic, no acknowledgement of positive gains. So this is all stuff that many organizations are experiencing right now. And this is great. Thank you so much for sharing some of the challenges that you think you're going to have. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can kind of approach our work and how we can think about our work in order to improve, during this transition. So a couple of things we're going to do. We're going to do some pandemic takeaways. We're going to talk about transitions. We're going to talk about something called smart work design. And then we're going to apply smart work design. And then we're going to spend some time talking about assessment. And then I'm going to leave the floor open for some time for Q&A, hopefully somewhere in the range of minimum 10 minutes. All right. So we know before we can start to think about the future or about the return, we really have to think about what our experiences have been during the COVID-19 experience. And so college students went through enormous number of changes. We as administrators, as faculty, we went through enormous numbers of changes, teaching virtually, having to wear masks, having to, deal with PPE and social distance, and then now returning back into the classroom. So at Farmingdale State College, where I teach, we went back to campus for the most part last semester. We're continuing that trend this semester, and this has been a big change because we had gone through an enormous change, learning new technology, learning new tools, using new techniques, and then now kind of like merging those things that we learned earlier and taking that information and saying, okay, now we're going to kind of create some sort of new campus environment. And so these experiences were really challenging. So we need to kind of reflect on that and take some time to consider all the things that we've learned, all the things that we want to take away from that experience. What is it that we really, have gained from that experience in terms of, knowing what we can do, what works, what doesn't. All right. So very, very important to consider. All right. In addition to this, one thing we know about the COVID-19 pandemic is that it's really affected and accelerated a lot of the external pressures that we as as college employees, university employees are experiencing. So number one, in terms of student enrollment, across the country, about 1 million students have chosen not to continue with college at this time, mostly for two big reasons. One is they didn't want to have this sort of non-traditional COVID affected college experience. And number two, wages in traditionally low-paying jobs have increased quite a bit. So you can work at a warehouse, you can even work, some fast food jobs, some delivery jobs, and get paid, quite a bit of money, that originally we didn't see. Just to put this into perspective, I was driving around Long Island, that's where I'm at, and I saw a sign at a Burger King for $15 an hour. And if you told me that in the year of our Lord 2022, Burger King would be paying $15 an hour, I would have called you a liar in 2019 because I didn't think that was going to happen. And now that is happening, and so students, choosing to say, hey, maybe I'll just make this money and then I'll come back. They do intend to come back, but that's impacted student enrollment today and potentially for the next couple of years. Second big thing, student completion. Getting students to finish has been very difficult during this time period. It's maybe not the same to communicate or deal with students virtually, and the experience hasn't necessarily been the same. All of this means that we're also potentially experiencing budget shortfalls. So there's been a lot of pressure, that we've been facing in this type of setting, where and this is traditionally not something that colleges and universities have really worried that much about. Some schools have, but state university systems, city university systems, they might be concerned about how much they're spending, but budget shortfalls were not that big of a concern. Now they seem to be a much larger concern. And then the last thing, because of the polarized political climate that we're in right now, we're seeing political pressure in all sorts of spaces, whether that's having to do with mask mandates, vaccination, whether that has to do with critical race theory. Who heard of that before last year? All of these things are impacting our experiences on campus. Now, one question that I have for everybody here is, just want everybody to think about this for a moment. We've gone through some of the pressures that the CUNY system and other university systems are experiencing, but what makes CUNY and universities unique as workplaces? So Clemente mentioned that I am an industrial organizational psychologist. That's my training, and I love thinking about workplaces. But what is it about the university system that makes it a unique workplace? Right? Before we can think about transitioning back to, what a university looks like, everybody in the chat can identify one thing that you think makes a university a unique workplace. Let's see what ideas you might have. You can type those into the chat. All right, so Samantha mentioned student help us stay on top of trends, social in the workplace, their futures. Excellent. Okay, that's really interesting. So good salaries at CUNY. All right, diverse students and staff. So we have diversity, and we have to deal with a student body that is very diverse. Farah mentioned stable benefits, right? So many times city benefits, state benefits, much better than other benefits that we might see, right? In other organizations. Irene mentions that just who you are as a community is very different. Tina mentioned the living and learning environment. So I'm glad you mentioned that, Tina. This is really interesting because people are living on this campus. Christina mentioned helping college students to achieve their goals. It's like nothing else I've ever experienced. So I want everybody to remember that because we're going to come back to that in a little bit. All right. And Elizabeth mentions that you're supportive, very supportive community. So thank you everybody for sharing that because you'll notice that all of these things reflect your diverse body of stakeholders, right? You have faculty that you're supporting. So if you're a faculty member, you have a unique job. You have a unique type of situation that you're in. If you're in administration, you're facing unique challenges in helping faculty do their jobs, in helping students, succeed. If you're, part of like physical plant staff, you're part of that support system, that network. And then remember, some students work in campuses, whether it's graduate students who are, TAs, whether that's undergraduates that are working staff jobs, they happen to work within that campus, and then they are our most important stakeholder. And Shannon mentioned being a part of a supportive environment and impacting our students for their entire lives. And that's ultimately the stakeholder that we're most interested in, the ones that we're most concerned about. So this is a really important consideration. So all of these stakeholders help us to think about what the experience is like of working in a college campus. So working in a college campus, you've got work life and you've got home life. And your work life is going to change depending on the role that you happen to have. If you're a faculty person, your work life may include some elements of taking work home. So even before the pandemic, as a faculty member, I took work home with me. It was just something that happened. If I got an email from a student, I responded to it, right? So there was some element of bringing that work back with me, taking it back with me, and keeping it with me, and working in that way. Your home life, it has been affected by what you're able to do now because of some of the changes in CUNY and SUNY systems. You may have greater access to things at work that you didn't have before. As a community member, you're also part of campus life. So some of you may volunteer to be a part of additional committees to improve campus life. If you're like me, a faculty member, you might be someone who is supporting, a club on campus. Even as a staff member, you may support student groups or other campus community initiatives. And then we're always being affected by world events. And the really interesting difference between campuses and college campuses and other types of businesses is that world events sometimes come to us. It's not like other businesses might have students protesting or conducting a walkout for political issues that they care about. Those things come home to us very, very often. This is all to say that in order to really understand the transition back to work, we've really got to understand what the experience of work is on the college campus. So when Clemente reached out to me about talking about this topic, I wanted to look at some of the cutting edge research that's been happening in the world of industrial organizational psychology to kind of give everybody a sense of what we could do as we transition back to semi-normalcy, right? Not totally normal, but a new phase of work. So this has been a crisis, but we know that sometimes crises open up opportunity for us and can open up a way for us to develop change. For those of you who know a little bit about organizational development, usually change happens due to an inciting incident. And COVID-19 is a great example of an inciting incident that we theoretically could use. So one major element of the pandemic for college campuses has been that we went from doing everything for the most part face-to-face live to moving it to the virtual world. Now, I'm going to speak about that experience from my experience of being a faculty member. I used to be able to roll into a classroom and I knew exactly where things were. I knew where I would set up the podium. I knew what I would log into. I knew exactly how I would want to work with students, how I would want to lecture. All of those things were already set. When the change happened from in-person to virtual, I had to rethink every element of the work that I was doing. So things that had traditionally been done without any thought, I now had to consider, and I had to say, well, okay, how do I think about this work? How do I break up this work so that I understand what elements I can continue to do in the traditional way or that have to stay traditional, and what can I do virtually? And then now, as we're transitioning back, what I'm going to ask you to think about is, well, what can you do to maximize your own efficiency? What worked better in the virtual world? What worked better in a face-to-face environment? And one of the biggest challenges for universities and college campuses is that, for those of you who've been working in CUNY system for a long time, we know that things don't move that quickly. They just don't. But we moved very, very quickly during the pandemic. And so there may be some lessons in that for us. So one of the hottest ideas to come out of the recent research over the last 2 years in industrial organizational psychology is something called smart work design. Smart work design is an acronym. So SMART stands for stimulating, mastery, agency, relational contact, and tolerable demand. Now, this model is very similar to an older model developed by Hackman and Oldham. Let's see. So Irene, I'll be happy to share the slides. So you don't have to, this isn't like a traditional class. I'm happy to share the slides with everybody. So I'd rather you have conversation with me through the chat than take notes. As much as I like watching a lot of people write notes in little boxes on the Zoom screen. So this approach can help us to start to think about, well, what can I do to look at the work that I'm doing, or what can I do for my team or for my department to make my workplace more effective and more interesting, more engaging. So this is an older model, originally built by Hackman and Oldham, but updated by Sharon Parker and colleagues in a study that came out in 2021. So let's define each of these. So stimulating work basically means that it's work that has some sort of task variety. One of the challenges of working virtually has been that a lot of stuff that we've been doing has been through the computer. So we've been sitting in front of a computer for a really long time, but there are ways to generate task variety, to create different tasks or work on different things at different times. So maintaining that sort of stimulation, maintaining that and doing it so that you will stay motivated and be more proficient. And as managers, if you have subordinates, asking them to switch things up. So every 15, 20 minutes, taking a break or working on something else so that people don't necessarily get bored, right? This also extends to skill variety. So some tasks require repeated skills. So for example, if I'm grading papers and then I'm writing a research study or a manuscript, those are very similar skills. It's still writing, right? Whereas if I decide that I'm gonna, do a little bit of writing and then I'm going to do some reading, I'm gonna, read an academic journal article, that's very different. So these are two different skills. And so if we want to make the work stimulating for ourselves and for our subordinates, then what we want to do is we want to be aware of what tasks are people doing. Can we switch things up a little bit? Can we provide an outlet for people to work on different things in terms of skill variety as well? And then problem-solving demands. So there's a certain amount of stress that's good, right? This is known as eustress. Usually this comes from demands that people are experiencing at any given time. But we want to make sure that those demands don't exceed a certain level. And so that we want to kind of structure our work so that we are trying to, complete it in such a way so that those problem-solving demands don't happen, don't become too much. And we also want to give people the opportunity to solve problems in their own way. When people are free to do that, the work itself becomes much more stimulating. That stimulation, according to this theory, is supposed to lead to some sort of mastery. So mastery of work includes things like role clarity. So making sure that people know what they're supposed to be doing, whether it's working on a committee, whether it's working in a department, whether it's working in a classroom, whether it's dealing with a faculty member, being really clear about what somebody's going to do allows them to develop that mastery. Allowing someone to complete an entire task. So, giving them that task identity is very important. So if somebody's in charge of something, letting them complete it, highly important in this model. Providing feedback, right? Actually giving feedback and saying like, hey, here's what you did well, here's what you need to work on. That over time will allow people to develop competence and mastery. So very, very important consideration for us there. Right? In addition to that, that mastery can lead to something called agency. Agency has to do with how we make choices. So earlier somebody mentioned talking about scheduling demands. So having that autonomy to choose when you come into work or how much work you're going to do is very important. One of the advantages of some of the changes that you might have seen in your workplace is you now have access to a lot of virtual information, virtual databases, so you can do things more on your schedule, and your schedule can be expanded to all sorts of different times. So you may want to work on stuff on at a 9 to 5 time. You may want to shift some of that work later in the day. For some of the work that we have on campuses, though, it's got to stay traditional. And you may want to try to think about new ways of scheduling, new ways of providing autonomy, new ways of giving freedom to your employees. One way to do that is to let them figure out what the work method should be. One thing that we learned in the past 2 years through the pandemic is that, you can decide that something is traditional, that you should do work in a particular way. But if there's a more efficient way for somebody to accomplish that work, let them choose the method, let them have that method and approach if it works for them. And so we know in all the different ways that we've been working on things over the past 2 years that there is flexibility in the methodology. Some of the technology allows us to do that. And then giving some people decision-making authority in a different setting can be helpful. And sometimes that decision-making authority, it might be that you have a decision that you're supposed to make, but you can give it to someone else if you feel like you need feedback or ideas, right? So agency not only means that, well, I have to do it, I'm in control. It also means that you get to control who helps you on projects. And so you can expand that sphere of influence that you might have. One thing that we've been craving throughout the pandemic is that sense of personal connection. And so one of the best parts of this theory is this idea of relational, focusing on relationships. So improving task significance. Earlier, when I asked what people saw as challenges, what they really liked about university life, I forget who, but somebody mentioned that they love interacting with students. And so there's a great way of showing task significance, how important and impactful people's decisions are in this process. In addition to that, providing social support. I don't know how many of you have done this, but my department has a chat thread where we're supporting each other, communicating with one another, dealing with one another. Sometimes it's just happy pictures of children that are being shared. And that's the type of social support that we might need. Once again, allowing people to choose work methods, allowing people to choose methodologies for how they're going to communicate with one another can allow for a lot of much better communication. And then once again, that idea of task significance, right? All of this leads us to another big concern that we have, which is tolerable demands, right? All of these different stakeholders that we have to deal with, students, faculty, administrators, they have all sorts of demands that they're taking on us. And so we want to make sure that we stay within those tolerable demands. One of the biggest issues was time pressure. We had so many changes happening that there was enormous time pressure. And so what we want to make sure that we do is that we both give ourselves enough time, and that we give our subordinates, and in some cases students, enough time to complete the tasks that we happen to have. And making sure that we have enough time and that we think about those granular tasks in such a way that we can actually complete them effectively. There's also emotional demands. One thing that happens is if you can work from anywhere, it means that you can't escape work. But this also means that you may not be able to escape life. So occasionally during this presentation, you may see me look over to my left, And that would mean I'm looking at my phone because I'm getting a text message. My son is in daycare, so maybe I'm thinking about what's going on with him. I have to pay attention to those things. We have a level of accessibility that we haven't had in the past. And so those emotional demands, understanding what the effect of those emotional demands is very powerful. That means that we have a role conflict between being, partners, spouses, wives, caregivers, parents, workers, all of those things. We tend to have those demands, and sort of being understanding around how to restructure this work so that we can create space for all of those demands is very important. We can do some of that ourselves, but it may be valuable for your team to sit down and have a conversation around what those demands are, what those demands look like, and what those demands should be, and how they might, how they might impact our team members. This also means that if you're running a meeting, and I know you had a session earlier about meetings, you want to be mindful of that time and understand where those demands are and what work should be done in the meeting versus giving people the time to figure out when they're going to complete that work on their own. Okay. Ultimately, this smart work design process doesn't work if we don't engage our stakeholders. One of the keys in getting people to think differently about their work is communication. And one of the keys there is communicating as needed. One of the things that's been happening is because we have these little devices that we carry around in our pockets, these phones, they give us access to people in ways that we never had before. So being aware of when we have to communicate and when we choose not to, choosing a method and an approach is really important. So understanding what needs to be a text message, what has to be an email, what has to be something that we send through the internal systems within our university, very, very important. You want to make sure that you match the medium with the message. So if there's something that is urgent, maybe it warrants a phone call, maybe it warrants a text message. If it's something that may take a little bit more time or doesn't have the time demand that we talked about earlier, maybe we need to switch it up and turn it into an email, right? Very, very important. We want to make sure that we match the message as well with the technology, right? So a text isn't useful for everything, right? Some of us might feel inundated with emails and might say to ourselves, well, I'm not sure when or how this is supposed to be done. So there are alternative tools, alternative ways that we want that we may want to work. We have to kind of make decisions within our own teams about what those, what appropriate approach there is with regard to technology. So these are conversations that we can have with our team members that can help us quite a bit. But these are things we probably never thought about before until this pandemic happened, so that we can kind of work more effectively. In addition to this, we have to think about quality. So in research from Shockley et al. From 2021, what they found was that communication quality really had an impact on engagement. So the more clear your communication was about what you needed, what was necessary, and the more straightforward it was, the better it was. And the more engagement you happen to see among employees. In addition to that, communication frequency, how often you're getting the message, how often you're getting messages about a particular topic is very, very important. So making sure that people are still getting reminders. So not only do you want to set a project timeline, a project deadline, you want to build in check-in meetings to make sure that people are staying on track, that they're completing the work as needed and as necessary. Very, very important to do. One other thing to remember is to look at your technology. Make sure, especially because when we're talking about communication, we really are talking about technology in many ways. So making sure that that technology is accessible and making sure that you and your team have set clear parameters for when you're going to use certain technology, what tools are going to be necessary. One of the biggest areas of confusion that we can see from some research about the experience of the pandemic is some employees not being sure about which tool to use for which type of communication. So clarifying that for them. So not only clarifying the role that somebody has, but what tool they should use to do this. How would you like this report? Does it get uploaded into a database? Does it get uploaded into one of your systems? Does it get emailed to someone? What is that process? So defining that process is incredibly important. So building the technology into these processes is very, very important. So making sure that people have access and understand when and how these things should be placed is incredibly important. The other thing to remember about the technology is ideally it should be flexible. So you want to make sure that you use whatever platforms you happen to have, try to use those across multiple contexts, whatever contexts are most appropriate for that. In my experience working at Farmingdale, we saw some real success in using some of our tools in multiple ways. And we really were very, it was very useful for us to use a tool that we already had some familiarity with and kind of expanding its use beyond what we had originally. So you want to maximize those platforms. Your organization's already paying for it, use them as much as you can. And then make sure that you use the technology to actually connect with people. And that means, making sure that it's not just task-oriented, directional stuff that you're giving to people, but you're actually using the tool to communicate, right? With the advent of emojis and memes and GIFs and all of these things, you can have a little bit more fun in some of these, within some of these tools than we had before. And we know from some of our research in communication that using emojis and using other kind of humanizing techniques can be really valuable in keeping engagement with people in in this work context. Very, very important consideration for us. All right. Ultimately, what we want to make sure that we do, and one of the things that I noticed in the comments that people left about their experiences on college campuses, that we love being with people. We enjoy our students, we enjoy our colleagues, and so what we want to do is we want to think about campus design not just in terms of the physical environment, but also in terms of that virtual environment. So technology can allow us to connect in a variety of ways. If you can imagine a world pre-Facebook, that you connect with people now. This is how we get updates about, kids, pets, family life, is through these virtual tools. And so there may be ways in which we can use the internal tools that we have within our organization to maximize that, to get more out of that. We want to be mindful, of course, of differences across, technology access, and be aware that we can communicate our differences in that way, whether that's demographic, generational, and whether that's a question of access. So very, very important for us to consider how people use technology and how they can kind of communicate a little bit of themselves in that process. We know from some of the communications research that the more personalization people can indicate through technological tools, the more they feel like they're being engaged and that they can actually communicate with. Right? Ultimately, what we want to do as well is we want to make sure that we assess whatever programs we have to put forward. So in my consulting work, I usually use this slide to talk about how an organization can kind of assess their practices, their people practices. So they need to determine a problem, they want to create an intervention, they want to identify the outcomes that they happen to have, measure some variables, calculate the results, and then present them, and then make changes accordingly. This should look pretty familiar to anybody who's worked in assessment practice. But ultimately, what I want to ask everybody to do is, if you say you're going to use a technique, you're going to, approach or change something, within your organization or how you're approaching a problem, make sure that you assess how well it's working. And that can work on a personal level, or it can work on a, on a departmental level, campus level, so we can really start to understand what the impact happens to be. What that means for us, both for us personally and for our departments, is we want to listen. And we want to think about the different data sources that'll tell us where we're at. So there could be student enrollment, could be student satisfaction if we're looking at university data, any feedback around educational quality. So it could be things like observations. It could be external data that we're looking at, the market position of of the university, the branding, the program alignment, what accreditation agencies say, or even rankings. All of that can help us to figure out how well we're doing as a department and as a school. But ultimately, what we want to do is we really want to listen, both internally and externally. So when we talk about listening, are we taking those class surveys seriously? Are we doing focus groups with students to find out whether or not the technology that we're using actually meets those smart work design guidelines that we've been talking about? Are we looking at employee engagement survey results? Are we talking to staff in focus groups? Are we conducting exit interviews? So if we are seeing staff leaving a particular department, do we understand why? When we look at faculty, what are they talking about in the faculty senate? What are faculty engagement numbers looking like? What are faculty saying about their experience in the workplace? And then outside of the university, externally, what are people saying about the university? Are we making best of lists? Where are we in terms of our market and our position? All of these things are things that we want to look at and we want to use to assess what's happening within our organization and our implementation of a smart work design. All right. Now, I've given you tons of things to think about. I know that this is very common. It happens all the time that I give 1,000 things or 1,000 ideas for you to follow, and I'm going to ease everyone's mind. I'm going to say you don't have to do everything. So if you can't do everything, I'm going to suggest that you pick one or two things from what I've talked about today. Some elements of the smart work design model, maybe something in terms of communication, maybe something having to do with technology, whatever you feel is most impactful for your department, yourself, your organization. And then think about what data sources you're going to use to diagnose that problem and then treat that problem so that you'll know whether or not what you decided to implement is actually working. If you're planning on buying a technology, please make sure you question the vendor around that technology. Or if you have some tech vendors, make sure you reach out to them and you get as much information about what your expectations are with regards to this technology as possible. And finally, I want to make sure that everybody understands that these processes are what we call iterative. So you're going to make a change, you're going to evaluate it, and then you're either going to continue it or discontinue it. And this is going to be a process. Many times when we talk about changes within the workplace or returning to work, or thinking about how we're going to make hybrid work function or remote work function, we think, well, this is the decision I made and I'm stuck with it. But the reality is that you can change, and you can change based on that type of assessment. So if you find that the communication technique that you've used, you're sending out too many emails, for example, cut it down. You can change it. You can make that change as needed, right? Now, I wanted to mention, before shameless self-promotion on my part, for those of you who enjoyed today's session, I've got a book coming out all about leadership and the Marvel Cinematic Universe. In case you're interested, you can check that out. And then I want to thank everybody for hanging out and listening to me for about 30 minutes or so. And I've left some time at the end here, about 5 minutes for questions. But I'm happy to stick around longer. Any questions that I can answer? Thank you, Samantha. It is a fun crossover. I'm a huge nerd. So anytime I can mix nerd stuff with IO psychology, I'm happy to do it. So any questions about anything that I've talked about with regards to smart work design, with regards to communication techniques, technology? Yes, I'm happy to go back and talk about the book. So there we go. You can check that out. Any questions about anything that I've talked about so far? Or about, hopefully we're talking about assessment. Hopefully thank you very much, Tawana. I appreciate it. Hopefully this session has been helpful for you to think about returning to work in a different way. Hopefully this helps you to think about, work in terms of, and returning to remote work in a new manner. And you can hopefully get a lot out of this process. So feel free to type a question in the chat, or to unmute and tell me what your question happened to be. Thank you very much, Teresa. I'm glad you found the tips useful. Ingrid, thank you very much. I'm happy to be here, but I'm also happy to answer any questions that you might have.
I don't have a question. I'm just thinking out loud. I'm just throwing this out there. So in terms of communicating, I know so many people who are like really excited about going back to work and being, in the building, just to have that social aspect, right? And so for so many months now, a lot of our communication has been via Teams or Zoom or some sort of online collaboration tool. But I don't know, like, do you imagine people just now showing up at your office, like, all the time now, like, hey, I'm here, and we're just feeling uncomfortable, or are we embracing that? Like, so my mind is like, what is that going to look like? This communicating, right? So now we don't necessarily have to use Zoom because we'll be in person again. But how comfortable are we going to be with that in-person communicating, right? I know that many of us miss those informal meetings in the hallways or in the restroom or in some sort of food area. We longed for it. Now it's being presented to us again. I don't know how accepting of that we're going to be.
So this is a really important question. I'm really happy you asked this, Tawana, because
we're frozen. Well, I'm frozen. Everyone else is frozen.
All right. Well, wait a minute.
Okay.
Okay, there we go. We're back.
Okay, there we are.
Back.
Right,
okay.
right. Yeah.
All right.
So I just threw out a whole lot of stuff.
That's okay. Honestly, the last 2 years have been a lot. So I'll answer it this way. So when we were talking about the transition from face-to-face to or from face-to-face to virtual, I mentioned that everything that we'd taken for granted, we now had to make an active choice about. So the best way to kind of address this is to really be upfront about it. And this can be a team thing or it can be an individual thing. So for example, you might not feel comfortable meeting with people or face-to-face for a variety of reasons, right? And you may have to make that absolutely clear that, you know what, I'm back in the office, but guys, I need you to text me before you show up, and I need you to wear a mask. And this is important because we don't know what other people's situations are. We don't know if they're immunocompromised. We don't know if they have a child at home and they're concerned about that, or it could just be nerves or their personal preference. One thing we really want to be mindful of is we want to establish, and I will steal Stephanie's word here, we want to establish those boundaries. But this is a conversation that 2 years ago, we never would have thought to have. We never would like, whatever, I see you in the hallway, great, I'm going to talk to you. And that's a really important question. And all I can say is my one suggestion is to think about what you want your work to look like. And, and also that doesn't mean that this has to be forever, right? Hopefully by the end of this year, fingers crossed, 22, once 22 is over, maybe things just go back to normal in 23. Maybe we ease back on those concerns over time. And that I think is totally possible and something that I think is a really important consideration for us. So does that help at all?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and you shouldn't feel guilty to not necessarily feel comfortable with people just popping in. We're still in the middle of a pandemic. So that is not over yet. So asking for that is not not unreasonable. So Stephanie says, I also think we need to ask people what they are comfortable with in terms of in-person interaction if they have not specified. Yes, very important. Do not assume. All right, I see Elise, I think you've got your hand up.
Yep. Hi. Thank you. Hi, Sai. So I don't know if you have an answer to this, but I'd be curious of your thoughts. As we know, CUNY and academia in general is probably, they're very slow to change in terms of cultures and how we do business. And at CUNY, there's a big bureaucracy. So in terms of how, like I know a lot of private corporations, how things have impacted on the companies is a lot of people are permanently working from home or hybrid, or as I think Ingrid referenced earlier, the demand for more in-person events again. I mean, and we are, there are different institutions in different sectors. So I don't want to say everything's the same across the board because it's not. But I'm wondering how we could, within our domain, maybe how we can incorporate some of these kinds of new ways of whether it's events or communication or whatever, within the context of having, again, being within a large bureaucracy. So wondering what you thought about all that.
So one of the biggest challenges of working in bureaucracy is you've got to get approval for a lot of changes that you might want to make. And so my usual suggestion is to think about especially bureaucracies, to kind of think about the political landscape and who has influence over the types of decisions and the types of changes that you want and how you can make those changes. sometimes that requires a proof of concept. So you may just want to do like a pilot program, say, hey, this is how we're running our meeting. You may want to talk to some of your colleagues in other departments. Maybe they're already doing some of the things we've been talking about. And that can become a proof of concept for you to speak to somebody in the bureaucracy and say, hey, we're going back to face-to-face events, but we're still including a virtual component for people who want to attend but cannot, or don't plan on arriving face-to-face. One of the biggest reasons to understand why there's a push to return to face-to-face is colleges are more than just the classes, right? There is enormous revenue in food, in parking, in all sorts of things. And it's not just CUNY, it's every university. So when we think about the in-person desire to go back to in-person, there's, not only, a desire for normalcy, but it's also a desire for potentially revenue. So we kind of have to be mindful of that and be aware of that as something that the bureaucracy cares about. And that may be something we have to be more upfront about in terms of talking about. And that's also something that I think many in university systems don't think very much about because, universities are not profit generating entities in the traditional sense. But it is something, if you're going to create change within a bureaucracy, you do have to think about it from that level, from the admin level, and okay, what's going to create that push? What wonderful question. Thank you, Elise. I see Maria, you have a question.
Yes, thank you so much, Sai. I think this was very informative, and I want to say hi to Taiwana. We used to work together at the Graduate Center.
These are the social connections that I'm happy to see.
Yes.
So I just want to bring to the attention to you guys. I'm from Hunter. So when we last semester went back to a portion of the classes in person, students were eager to take classes in person. They couldn't wait to do it. And they are very excited about it. And they registered for it. And then they switched because they thought they're going to go to campus. They thought they're going to have the college experience and make connections with colleagues and make connections with classmates and friends, make friends and with instructors. And it didn't happen. It didn't happen. They didn't like the public transportation. They were afraid to take it. They came to the class. Everybody just came in, took classes and left. There was no space to socialize. There was no really, people were wary about it. We're very careful about it. So it didn't happen. They ended up transferring for online classes. There was a big move of people dropping in person and moving to online classes. So I just want to call the attention that it may happen with us. Some of us are eager to go back, some are not. And I think we just have to be a little bit careful about expectations.
That is absolutely true. And one thing that Maria, your story highlights is things are changing, right? Even though we're talking about the pandemic is winding down, one of the big concerns is cases spiking, hospitalization spiking, and that can happen again. If it does happen again, then we are in, then we may go back to some more stringent virtual component. And that's been one of the hardest parts about this, the pandemic and the process and experience that we've had is how hard it's been to make any sort of decision about what to do and how to kind of keep that decision. And this is also something from the student perspective as well, is going back to the commute, going back to that. It was funny. I hadn't gone to campus for so long that last year when I came back, last semester when I came back, I was like, man, I forgot I need to give myself more time to shower and be ready. Because before it was like I'm rolling out of bed and I'm right here. Now I have to remember, oh, I got to park, I got to do this, I got to, so it's a whole host of changes. So all of those things that we took for granted, we're going to have to rethink those, and we may have to go back. Hopefully not. Hopefully this is, this is the end for us on that front. Helen, I see your hand up.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm glad I could join. This was in regard, more of a comment in regard to the questions about like the boundaries of feeling comfortable with folks. I recently attended something that was about working with neurodiverse folks, and there was something I learned there that might have an application, and if it's useful, then great. But they talked about at a conference or a workshop that they did, they had name tags with red, yellow, and green on it, indicating one's comfort level with sort of socializing. And I thought about the possibility of like maybe putting something on a doorway, at least internal with colleagues that we have, because I sense within my team that people have different levels of comfort. And from the folks who had attended that conference who had neurodiverse children or whatever, they just said that was so eye-opening and life-changing for those folks, because there were some that were ready to really engage and some that weren't, and it can change day to day, right? Like I'd like that just with my own kids, like, don't bother me now, or sure, of course. Not that I do that with my kids.
That is actually great. Ellen, may I add one thing to that? Because we were talking about skill variety and task variety, but maybe you want to have a variety of interactions. Maybe there are time periods where you don't want somebody stopping in. You have that red card on the outside. Maybe there are other days where you say to yourself, well, I really want, I really want more interaction, or I'm more open to interaction at this time. And you can put that green line right there. So very, very interesting. All right, so Maria, looks like you've got the last question here.
Yeah, I just want to share one thing more. It made me think about interactions in my office. I had a staff member, so my staff works in one common office, and I have one person who refused to vaccinate. It created a really uncomfortable situation for everybody. And the chancellor's message was, that person should let the supervisor know we moved to a different place. It created a huge problem because people didn't feel comfortable being around her. She didn't feel comfortable leaving because she felt discriminated about leaving. So I think we have to be very careful about interactions, of course, trying to protect ourselves and protect others, but be very careful because people may take actions and words in very different ways.
Very, very important consideration. And, we talked a little bit about this political polarization around vaccines and masks and things like that, and just being, kind of both respectful, but also kind of navigating that situation as best you can is really, really important. So thank you. That's a great, that's a great point to kind of end on. Clemente mentions transparency, communication are key when discussing tough conversations. Absolutely correct. Making sure that people know those expectations. Remember, we talked about that idea of role clarity. Here's your role. Here's what you can do. If somebody refuses to get the vaccination, is there a way for us to shift them to virtual work for a certain amount of time, or stagger schedules in a way where maybe they're working with fewer people? I mean, that's the type of creativity that the pandemic requires of us, but it also might give us an opportunity to make work a little bit better for ourselves. All right, very good. So I don't want to take up too much time, but 1:57, that means we got 3 more minutes left. So thank you, Christina. Thank you, Tawana. If there are any other questions, I'm happy to stick around, but I will let everybody go. But thank you so much. You've been a wonderful audience. Thank you for hanging out with me, and hopefully this this is very useful. If you have any questions, I will mention I've got my email right here. You can always email me if you have other questions that come up. I spend a lot of time on Twitter and LinkedIn. You can always reach out. I'm happy to answer questions, for anybody, or even just to commiserate. That's cool too. So thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sai, and everyone else for showing up and, connecting. And I think it's just a great topic, especially now as we're transitioning back. Just before we end up, I know Clemente previously shared, I'll share it again in the chat. There's going to be a lot of resources, and we'll definitely share Sai's contact info and this video presentation as well, in case some of you guys want to connect with him or ask him questions. And lastly, just to end it off as well, as we're transitioning back, our next event, our CUNY IO Talk, is going to be, I put the link to register in the chat. It's work-life balance interventions as we're all transitioning, which I think is something that's impacted as many of us working either from home or hybrid or some sort of model, and trying to see, how can we balance, our personal lives with work. So that's going to be coming up. So thank you so much, Sai, and everybody else for showing up and for sharing your information. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks for having me, Robinson. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you,
Okay.
everyone, for attending as well.